Hello once more. I mentioned last time that I would try and do a continuation video of my game of Unconditional Surrender. So here we are. The previous video ended, I think I was just going into July 41, and the game has been pushed on to October 42. So just over 12 months of gameplay on the map, and for those of you who have not played Unconditional Surrender, despite its size, which may put some people off, the game turns do actually click over quite quickly. I'd estimate that I'm doing a relatively quiet turn, and by quiet I mean poor weather, in about half an hour. Now that things on the Eastern Front have really started to ramp up, with the Russian forces becoming more reactive and having more options, it's probably pushed the game turns up to more like 45 minutes. So you can see, with a monthly turn game of the entire strategic war in Europe, 4 or 5 years of historical time takes a fair commitment from someone who wants to get through it all. But personally, I think it's a very engaging game, and the time goes very quickly. So we'll start in Africa, and I'll just chat through the general situation on the map, and then I'll do another little bit of footage of the map in a bit more detail, so you can see some of the pieces. North Africa previously was a bit of a stalemate situation. There was a bit of a standoff between the Afrika Korps and the Western Desert Force, and what turned that around was the arrival of the second Western Forces air unit, and also as a consequence of the sequence of play, because in Unconditional Surrender, the Axis do their operations subphase and their supply subphase before the Allies, and then both sides will do a replacement phase and a mobilisation phase. The important thing to note is that the replacement phase comes for both the sides after they've both had their operations, which means that if the Axis forces get damaged or reduced, flipped over on their turn, that the Allies will be able to attack them while they're still in that reduced state. And that's exactly what happened in Africa. The Afrika Korps got a bit unlucky. It was trying to push for Alexandria. It got flipped, which meant that it was in that same flip state at the start of the Western Allies operations phase, and was consequently destroyed by a combination of the Western Desert Force with their tanks, with their air force. So that was the sort of game changer, really, in the balance of power in Africa. Now the Italians are moving back to El Agheila, to Brooks Fallen. From El Agheila they'll be heading towards Tripoli, trying to survive so they don't affect the country's national will. Not sure if they're going to make it or not. It would be interesting to find out. The Afrika Korps was being rebuilt. That clearly cost the Germans some national will, and that's now being strategically moved down to Sicily in anticipation of things hotting up a little bit down there. Supplies being really tight over the Mediterranean for the Axis. The combination of Force H and also the American 4th Fleet. They're doing a bit of a swap, bit of an exchange role between Gibraltar and Malta, and the combination of those two has really squeezed the Axis supply situation. Britain's still relatively quiet. The Germans are down to their sort of minimal requirements in terms of what they have to have as their West Front garrison. The commencement of a strategic bombing campaign was seen 2 turns ago, being fended off fairly successfully by the Luftwaffe units on the Western Front. There is a tendency in the strategic warfare, I've found at this stage, may change in 43, 44, for there to be a tendency for things to revert back to the status quo. And that's really because of the order in which things are done. You do the Soviet strategic warfare first. They have +3 for the conquered miners, and I think the Axis are on +1 for their air unit in Norway. So they might get the odd factory lost to bump up on the Axis chart. But then when you come to roll for the Western Allies strategic warfare, following that roll, the Axis are +3 to the Western Allies at the moment, +2, which tends to push things back to where they were before. I'm sure as the bombing campaign heats up and and the 8th Air Force arrives as well, that's when that'll start to change. But it's just an interesting observation. The Eastern Front has been very mobile, lots of changes, mainly in Army Group Centre and South. The Axis have peaked, I believe, at capturing Stalingrad. Can't see them really going much further. Going into the Caucasus is not really an option. The city of Ryazan, I think that's pronounced reasonably. The city of Ryazan has changed hands a couple of times, but I don't think there's any danger of there being a collapse of Russian national will. It's currently sitting at I think 17, and although the Russians are still losing the odd combat unit, I think in terms of capturing more Russian cities, I can't really see that happening. So what I'm not sure about is how long it's going to take for things to start to swing the other way on the Eastern Front. But certainly enjoying the game very much. It's a big departure from the sort of traditional combat resolution type games that I've played before. The whole generally activating a single unit for combat. You can do assaults with up to 3 units, but generally you're tending to activate a single unit, expending movement points to launch the attacks, the do I commit or don't I commit air or the combat chits. Obviously you lose a little bit of that tension playing solitaire unless you've got a complete split personality. You could just roll a dice if you couldn't make up your mind what would be the best thing to do if you were playing it face to face. I don't really have a problem in trying to decide what would be the best thing to do for each side as each combat arises. So I've no idea if the Axis are doing well or not. It seems to be pretty historical. So whether the decline of the Third Reich will also happen at an historical pace remains to be seen. But I'll stop there and I'll just take a couple of minutes of the map so you can look at some of the pieces. Okay, we're now in Africa. This is Alexandria, now well behind the Allies' front line. Tobruk's now controlled by the British, and here are the remaining Axis land forces in Africa at the gates of El Agheila. We've got a British air unit here, another one in Benghazi. That's the Mediterranean fleet. Also in Benghazi, there's a garrison under there, and that's the Western Desert Force. So they're going to be trying to squeeze these guys back along the coast road. They just were able to be put into supply on the last turn, which basically was the last gasp efforts of the Italian Navy to supply their troops in North Africa. So the current state of the Italian Navy is pretty poor. I think it's 6 sorties on the warship and 4 on the convoy, and 6 on the warship and convoy that's in Taranto. Under the strategic move marker, that's the Africa Corps. Just move back down again into Sicily, and that's a fairly heavily used Italian air unit. It's the American 4th Fleet in Gibraltar, just about to shuttle back across to Malta to squeeze the Axis supply across the Mediterranean. Pretty much a minimal Western Front garrison. They're the 3 field armies that you are required to have, and the 2 air armies. One's in Frankfurt trying to defend the Reich against Bomber Command, and there's another one that's in Stavanger, I think that is. That was put in full supply by the convoy in Oslo last turn, because it wants to be, it needs to be there to completely cover the possible entries, or the entry points into Germany for the Allied strategic bombers. Starting to get a build-up of forces now in the UK. There's some American forces here, both land and air, and a couple of convoys, and I think another fleet's turned up as well. Moving across, we're now at the sharp end of the Eastern Front, and there we can see Stalingrad occupied by the German 20th Army. How long it shall remain there remains to be seen. This is the interesting thing about the combat system, is if you backstop a unit so that it can't retreat, if it suffers a retreat it just flips in place. So if you want to hold on to a hex, you can try and make that happen by defending in depth, which I think is quite a nice model to use in the system, because it does mean that once the Russians are able to make multiple attacks, at the moment they tend to make sort of single assaults, which just flips a unit which can then be potentially rebuilt on the German turn. But as their army improves, they'll be making multiple assaults, and therefore will potentially flip the German on the first mobile attack or assault, and then they'll attack again against the reduced strength defenders. The Russian Air Force is still on the back foot a bit on the Eastern Front. They're still outclassed by the Luftwaffe, so they tend to be able to get sort of local air superiority where they need it. That's the city of Ryazan, which is now back under German control, with the 18th Army have just taken it back with the assistance of the Italian Army with their tank assets. Leningrad and the Army Group North really hasn't moved for pretty much the last 6 to 8 months. All the activity's been down in the south, but I think there's going to be no drive for the oil. That's just not really feasible now that the Russians are getting their act together. So there you go. That's the map, just about to start. October 1942.